let me just share with you quickly how I got started. You would never imagine this. In 1982, when I was finishing up my Harvard Master's in Public Health, and I was asked, would I like to participate in educating gay folks and others about this thing called gay-related immune deficiency. This was before it was called AIDS. And I said, nah, I don't want to deal with that disease at all. I don't want to think about that at all. Here I am, 15 years later, 16 years later, and what am I doing? Traveling around the world, telling people about the man-made origins of AIDS and Ebola. I was working over here. My favorite area of research and teaching was in self-care, healthy human development, motivational psychology, teaching people, like Danny does, how to take better care of themselves, boost their immune systems. So I was really into that. I love that. That's my favorite thing. And one day, kind of like the miracle happened, where there was a crisis, and I was the right person at the right time. It was the 1990, July 27th. 1990, when the case of the Florida dental AIDS tragedy hit the press. You remember the case of the Florida dentist who infected his patients with the AIDS virus? And 3 years, at that time, I was serving as the world's leading dental and medical catalog supply company's chief professional advisor. And my background was in media, health education, health promotion, fear, because I worked on dental phobia reduction therapy programs, behavioral therapy programs to allay people's fear going to the dentist. And I've been a dentist for 16 years. And health education and media, persuasion, technologies. And here the media was making so many people afraid to go see their dentist in the wake of this case. So I was asked, I was told, I was given the job, opportunity to develop patient educational literature to help allay people's fear of going into dental medical practices. So I started to research. The Centers for Disease Control's official investigation reports in the case, I first found them to be scientifically questionable. I then found them to be scientifically bogus. And then later found them to be fraudulent. They had literally covered up, deleted the most incriminating evidence against the dentist, who I had to conclude after 3 years of studying this case and publishing 3 scientific reports, literally having to go out of the United States to publish, because the American Dental Association, American Medical Association wanted to maintain a cover-up. And I wrote a book that was based on those 3 scientific reports called Deadly Innocence, my 9th book, wherein I had to conclude that the dentist, based on all the evidence, using the FBI's own behavioral science literature, how they themselves investigate and evaluate these types of cases, that this dentist, scientifically trained, military dentist for much of his career, very intelligent dentist, believed that he was dying of a virus that the government had created. They covered that up. He believed that they had intentionally injected this virus during a 1978 experimental hepatitis B vaccine that was given to a lover of his that he had in 1985. And that's how he got infected. And he believed that this was genocide. And he believed in what was called the World Health Organization theory of AIDS. The videotape that Danny stated he saw, the Strecker Memorandum, was what Dr. David Acker believed. That the World Health Organization, the United States Public Health Service, Centers for Disease Control had something to do with the development of these types of viruses and the deployment of them through hepatitis B and other vaccines in Africa and North America. In essence, I have to conclude at the end of that case that the dentist most plausibly was identical to an organized serial killer. He maintained a classic organized serial killer personality. You know, like the Unabomber? These people, they all, according to the FBI, kill for the sake of power, control, and revenge. Revenge being the major theme. And the principal issue, his principal vendetta, was screaming loud and clear in the legal testimonies. It was against the federal government. In essence, I concluded that he created a crime. He did what all organized serial killers love to do. They manipulate the authorities into catch-22s. The Unabomber, he publishes his manifesto in the New York Times, Washington Post, says, here's what I believe, you try to get me. David Acker, the Florida dentist, was virtually identical to this. In essence, he created a crime, a mystery that could not be solved without implicating the government. Because if they told the truth, if they said he was an organized serial killer, then the whole world would want to know motive. And the motive was screaming loud and clear in the legal testimony, which they buried. So, There was one document, however, that came along with that videotape called the Strecker Memorandum that Strecker sent to David Acker. And it was the most horrifying document I had ever seen. It was a 1970 Department of Defense appropriations request for $10 million for a 5-year study to develop immune system ravaging microorganisms for germ warfare. And it said right in this document that the National Academy of Sciences, National Research Council, the most esteemed of all health science agencies in America, not only informed the Department of Defense that, quote, over the next 5 to 10 years it will be possible to make a new infective microorganism that could differ in certain important aspects from any known disease-causing microorganism. And most important of these is that it would be refractory to the immunologic and therapeutic processes upon which we depend to maintain our relative freedom from infectious diseases. End quote. And they not only told the Department of Defense that, this esteemed health science agency, but that it would cost them $2 million a year over 5 years to do it, but that they would help them to do it. So I believed our government at the time was not particularly trustworthy, but you know, I could not imagine that this document was legitimate. I lived in denial, like most people, most Americans, most people worldwide are living in denial today because they are so brainwashed, they are brain dead. I lived in denial just like that. I said, okay, I've heard some weird things, but here I'm looking at this, and it looks legitimate. So what do I do? All I know now is I've got the World Health Organization theory, and I've got this document. I know perhaps maybe if this document is legitimate, and indeed it was. In fact, what they were looking for specifically was in the congressional record. This was in the congressional record. They were looking for a, quote, super germ, end quote. That word was in the congressional record. That could wipe out the human being's immune system, the defense system against infectious diseases, leaving us, human beings, susceptible to the opportunistic infections like tuberculosis, like candidiasis, like yeast infections, like pneumonia, and like cancers. So this is what they're looking at. So ultimately, what did I do? I went back to Harvard's Countway Medical Library, where I did most of my postdoctoral research. And I go to the World Health Organization Chronicle files, and where do I begin? I start in 1965. Why? I figure, well, if the money maybe kicked in 1970, let me go 5 years before that and 5 years after that. And so I start by pulling World Health Organization Chronicle, their monthly journal, off the shelves, and I begin to read what they are involved in. And I was surprised, as a public health professional who, over the previous 5 years, had 4 times presented scientific papers at the American Dental Public Health Association meeting, I knew very little about the World Health Organization. Astonishing. I found out that this was like the godfather to the pharmaceutical industry. That they create the standards upon which the pharmaceuticals and the drugs, including the vaccines, are based. And they largely, I learned, help to determine which drugs remain legal and which ones would be illegal. It took me a while before I learned that this organization was largely controlled by the Rockefellers. But you see, by 1965, they had already had about 5 to 7 years under their belt in what was called the Virus Cancer Research Network. They were developing a cancer virus research network. And that by 1970, they reported that they had isolated well over 70,000 different strains of viruses. And when they said, quote, isolated, unquote, it took me another few weeks and months before I learned that what they really meant to say was mutated, recombined, hybridized isolates. And that by 1970, they reported having distributed these 70,000 different strains of viruses to well over 500 research laboratories throughout the world. And among their principal distributors of these viruses was none other than the National Cancer Institute in Bethesda and the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta. And you see, when I saw that it was the National Cancer Institute in Bethesda, a red flag came up for me. If you folks want to dim the light or turn this light off, just if that's not too much of a problem, just for a couple minutes while I talk about a little bit of the slides. You see, this is the home of the infamous Dr. Robert Gallo, who allegedly discovered the AIDS virus in 1984. You remember this? This was what prompted the French-American AIDS fracas. It was turned out that within weeks of Dr. Robert Gallo and Margaret Heckler announcing Dr. Gallo's find, a feather in the cap of American medicine, doctor at the National Cancer Institute, Dr. Robert Gallo, discovered the cause of AIDS. It's a virus. Then the United States patented everything having to do with AIDS virus research and testing. And then France ended up suing the United States when shortly thereafter was determined that Gallo stole Luc Montagnier's virus from France. And France ended up suing the United States. It was resolved about a couple years ago when, around the same time, President Clinton pardoned Robert Gallo for scientific misconduct. On another unrelated matter, whenever does a president of the United States pardon a health scientist? That's a little weird. But it happened to be the 4th time in 3 decades that Dr. Robert Gallo had been investigated for scientific misconduct and or fraud and had escaped, gotten off. So I immediately began to suspect Dr. Robert Gallo. I said, well, maybe I should go see what Robert Gallo was doing between 1965 and 1975. And so I go back and I look up Gallo in Index Medicus, Harvard's County Medical Library. What you see here is one of 6 pages. It's called the Scientific Literature Review that I've reprinted in the book Emerging Viruses, AIDS, and Ebola, where there was nothing in 65 that Gallo published. There was nothing in 66. 67, there were 2 publications. 68, there were 4. 69, there were 2. 70, there were 3. And 71, there were 8. Aha, just a coincidence, you see, that as the money kicked in for the Department of Defense, Robert Gallo's laboratory output more than doubled. Coincidence? Maybe, maybe not. And I began to read. And what were these people writing? Well, they were studying things that are very suspicious indeed. Here, this is from the journal Nature. By the way, because of what I am telling you, you also know to be so unbelievable. The concept that the United States government had something to do with the development of immune system ravaging viruses, AIDS virus, Ebola virus, that most people can't believe this. See, as a behavioral scientist, as a behavioral science expert, I knew most human beings who evolved, who developed because of loving parents who instilled ethics and morals and values could not conceive of this level of evil, that they would never believe it. If you leave here today, I guarantee you, 9 out of 10 people that you speak and you tell them about this, you will see a window shade of disbelief come across their eyes, and you know you're no longer talking to a human being with ears. And so, knowing that ahead of time, as a behavioral science expert, I said, I got to reprint the most incriminating documents so that it is totally there. It is no question. And so, this is one of numerous documents that you see reprinted in the book, Emerging Viruses, AIDS, and Ebola, where this is from the journal Nature, 1970. And you see Robert C. Gallo from the National Cancer Institute. You see Robert C. Ting from Bionetics Research Labs, Bethesda, Maryland. And it turned out that about a third of what Dr. Robert Gallo published, he published with Bionetics researchers. Have you ever heard of Litton Industries, folks? You know, Litton has Litton. They have microwave ovens. A lot of people know them from their microwave ovens. But besides microwave ovens, they're a highly diversified company. They're heavily involved. Interestingly enough, they are among always the leading military weapons contractors for the world. And they had a subsidiary, a medical subsidiary called Litton Bionetics Research Labs, which was a documented biological weapons contractor. And you see that Dr. Robert Gallo, about a third of 25% to 30% of what he published, co-authored with these people. Now here what they're studying, without getting too technical, is an enzyme called reverse transcriptase. It's actually, the technical name is RNA-dependent DNA polymerase of human acute leukemic cells. That is a unique enzyme called reverse transcriptase. It calls for life to operate in reverse, this enzyme does. What in God's universe calls for life to operate in reverse? Something satanic, in my opinion, don't you think? Well, you see, that's exactly what this enzyme does. You see, typically, God created everything in the universe, in particular life, all forms of life, to operate out of the same unique, magnificent system designed to perfection beyond the reaches of the wildest imaginations. And it's all based, He created this thing called DNA, the blueprint of life, the code. And you see, in God's magnificent cells and tissues, what it calls for is that DNA is to be taken, and from DNA, this blueprint, new RNA is created, which then serves to bring and establish proteins, amino acids and proteins to the protein manufacturing station of the cell called the ribosome. And it is here where proteins are built, new cell parts are built, and new cells, healthy, happy cells, evolve. So it goes, God's magnificent system goes DNA to RNA to new proteins to new cell parts to new life. This enzyme says, we're not going to have that anymore. We're going to go backwards. We're going to take a single strand of RNA that the virus is going to present. And because of the presence of this unique reverse transcriptase, a new DNA strand gets created. It's called a DNA provirus. And because of the presence of another very interesting enzyme, it's called an endonuclease. It's like a scissors. It cuts open God's magnificent code for life, and it allows this new DNA strand to get inserted. So that now when the perfect cell begins to read this code, this message for how to create new life, it gets fooled. It calls for the production of more viruses instead of healthy cell parts. And that these viruses butt off the cells. And because of these unique proteins on the outside membrane, they're called GP120-like proteins, like little balls here, you see? Through lock and key fashion, they seek out other cells, CD4 helper cells, T lymphocytes, the quarterbacks of the immune system. And they attach to these and they continue this process. Now, this is being done by Robert Gallo and his associates from Bionetics Research, and they're studying this in human acute, that's quick-acting leukemia cells. This is in 1970, folks. This is 14 years before this man allegedly discovered the first AIDS virus. This is the enzyme that makes the AIDS virus tick. This is also the enzyme that makes the leukemia virus work. And this is 9 years before this man allegedly discovered the first leukemia virus, HTLV1. And, as I said, his co-authors from Lytton Bionetics just happened to be 6th on the list of major Army biological weapons contractors at that time. This is directly from the United States Congressional Record. And as you see also, for those sitting in front and highlighted in yellow, is the New York University Medical Center. Remember that. I'm going to come back to that. There will be a quiz at the end of this program. And those who fail the quiz, it may cost you your life. Literally. So, what else were they doing? And publishing. Well, they were the world's preeminent experts in monkey cancer virus research. And what they were doing in not only monkeys, but primates, man as well, was they were taking these viruses that they knew would cause cancer. For example, they took woolly monkey viruses and rhesus monkey viruses, including this thing called SV40, simian virus 40. It was the 40th monkey virus ever discovered. And you see, this virus was discovered by a really wonderful human being, a wonderful woman by the name of Bernice Eddy. She found it in the Salk and Sabin polio vaccines. Late 50s, early 60s. She inoculated this vaccine containing SV40 into virtually every animal, and the animals started to die. She inoculated a dozen monkeys with these. All monkeys keeled over, paralyzed or dead. She took photographs. She presented the photographs to the National Institute of Health director, who confiscated the photos and then proceeded to demote and defund this woman. Took her 10 years before she struggled in a crusade to get to Congress. And in front of Congress, she said to the congressman, 1972, she says, if you continue to allow these contaminated vaccines to go out, I guarantee you over the next 20 years, you will have epidemics of cancer unlike the world has ever seen. It's come to pass, hasn't it? They didn't listen to her. But you see that this particular virus, I want you to know a horrifying reality for your health and for your children's lives, that this particular virus, to this very day, contaminates the oral polio vaccine that we are allegedly by law required to give our children. In fact, your FDA has to turn a blind eye to as many as 100 simian monkey virus contaminants per dose that we are allegedly by law required to give our kids. And you know why they don't tell you? They can't even tell health scientists the truth. So physicians never know, and the public never gets a clue. The reason that they don't tell you is their hands are tied by proprietary laws and non-disclosure agreements placed upon them by the pharmaceutical companies. They are muzzled by the drug makers. So they were taking this end. They took this virus, they took a number of other viruses, and they took human lymphoma viruses that they knew would cause cancer of the lymph nodes. And they began to recombine these with virtually every animal cancer virus known. Their favorite ones to work with was the feline leukemia virus RNA. This caused a whole laundry list of symptoms virtually identical to what AIDS patients suffer from. By the way, if you're a cat lover out there and you've lost cats to feline leukemia, sorry to tell you that the experts at the time said also, feline leukemia is man-made. They were recombining cat and human viruses, and they were doing all sorts of bizarre things. They also, their other favorite one to take was chicken leukemia sarcoma virus RNA. That caused wasting, immunosuppression, and death. And so you see, when they were around here with this mutant hybrid, in order to get this to jump species into humans, it still needed another major mutation. To get it to jump species readily, they reported culturing it in human white blood cells in some studies and human fetal tissue cells in culture in other studies, so that it would adapt. It would develop those unique proteins on the outside membrane called GP120-like proteins, so that it could attach to the human cells, be carried across the cell membranes, enter the gene of the cell, and then do virtually everything that the AIDS virus does. Now, they not only reported that, they reported where they presented that work. Some of it was reported in Mol, Belgium in 1970 in front of NATO military scientists. So when I had the great fortune and privilege, blessing of becoming the first investigator in the history of the esteemed International AIDS Conference on July 10th of last year, to present and defend during a scientific session a paper stating that these viruses, HIV and its relatives, are undoubtedly man-made laboratory creations. You didn't hear about that, did you? No. Interestingly enough, we had put out press releases, we put out copies of the paper, we had invitations to all of the media, all the Canadian media, all the American media. The Canadian media showed up en masse. I made it on every news radio station in Canada, every wire service in Canada, every newspaper, including the conservative Globe and Mail, carried at least short stories, some feature articles. CBC, Canadian television, filmed me, but they never showed it. But you know what? No one from the United States news media came. So if you think today that the American news media is not largely controlled, I think it's time that you have your brain examined. Right. So, but anyway, I had the privilege of presenting this research in front of some of the world's leading epidemiologists and AIDS experts and virologists who came to my presentation, many of them. And so they were arguing with me. Some of them said, well, so what, Dr. Horowitz? So were working on reverse transcriptase at that time. That doesn't mean anything. I said, okay, I can appreciate that. And then I showed them the congressional record, and they said, oh, that is interesting that they're 6th on the list of major Army biological weapons contractors. And I showed them the other material that I just showed you about combining monkey viruses and cat, and they said, oh, that is very strange. How do we know you're not telling us falsehoods? How do we know you're not making this up? I said, well, if you truly are interested, you can look up my references, which I have both in the book and in this paper. You can look it up for yourselves. And I said, but I might save you the time. And I then handed them a government document which explains exactly what I'm about to show you here. And I said, you read this, and then answer me this question, whether or not you think this might be risky to humanity. And I'll ask you the same question, and you see how you vote. Here's what they're doing. Besides biological weapons contractors, they are also working under the cover of National Cancer Institute research. They're also investigating whether viruses cause cancer in humans. They weren't sure, or at least they said that they weren't sure. I suspect now they were pretty sure. They also wanted to study whether vaccines could prevent viral-induced cancers. And here, in this particular study, they were looking at whether they could diagnose these viruses in the human tissues early in order to prevent them. You know, like breast screenings or pap screenings, pap smears, where if you identify a problem early enough, you can perhaps save a life. Hey, we can't fault these folks for doing that type of research. But here, the question is, do you think this type of research is risky? To begin, to develop an alternative approach for the detection of possible human leukemia viruses. They begin with a mouse sarcoma virus that caused sarcoma cancers in mice. And they recombined it with a mouse leukemia virus to create a mouse leukemia sarcoma virus hybrid that they then inoculated into healthy cats to get it to jump species from mouse to cat. Now they had a mouse leukemia sarcoma virus that was infectious for cats, which they then inoculated into a cat suffering from feline leukemia, cat leukemia. And you know what? Success! It worked, they reported. Next step, they report, take the same mutant hybrid, culture it through human embryonic cells, and then get it to jump species, therefore, to humans, and then try it on a human being suffering with leukemia. Now, how many of you, raise your hands if you think that this might be risky to the human race? Raise your hands. Okay, well, we got 100% in that question. I want you to know that although most of you represent a lay audience, there's some health professionals, health scientists perhaps here, but I want you to know that you concur with some of the world's leading AIDS epidemiologists, virologists, and cancer virus experts, who, when I showed them this and they read this, many of them, most of them, shook their heads. Some of them said, this is extremely risky. Some of them said, I can't believe they were doing this. This is mad. So this is what they were doing. Now, this was my thesis. I presented it. And one of the smoking guns in the book, Emerging Viruses, AIDS, and Ebola, was that the specific cancer virus immune suppression complex that these people spent most of their time and money studying during the highly funded and mostly secret special virus cancer program. Those of you who have been in the military know the word special means. It means covert, secret, virus cancer program. What they were studying mostly was the immune suppression, leukemia, lymphoma, sarcoma, cancer complex that never existed on planet Earth in human beings before 1978 with the outbreak of the first AIDS cases in New York and simultaneously Central Africa. So that is one of numerous smoking guns that we have. But, you know, when I presented this work, I had a story to tell you. Kind of a very fascinating story, a little bit disturbing. You've heard of Gulf War syndrome, haven't you? It overlaps Gulf War syndrome. I was in town doing radio interviews, as I said, in Canada. And there was a documentary film crew filming a vaccine documentary that asked if they could film my interview with Fanny Kiefer, one of Vancouver's leading talk show hosts. And I said, sure, be happy, come on. So they filmed me. At the end of the interview, the producer came up to me and said, Dr. Horowitz, did you know that Dr. Robert Gallo is in town this week? I said, no, I didn't know that. She says, yes, indeed. He's giving a public forum, public presentation, wherein the audience is invited to ask questions. Would you like to come and ask Dr. Gallo a question? So, you know, of course, those little horns pierced my scalp, you see. And so the next night, in front of about 300 Canadians, Canadian press, and a documentary film crew, I asked Dr. Gallo the following question. I said, Dr. Gallo, are you at all concerned that your early research using monkey viruses like SV40 and others, and recombining these with things like feline leukemia virus RNA and chicken leukemia sarcoma virus RNA might have given rise to the AIDS virus or AIDS virus relatives that might have contaminated chimpanzees and rhesus monkeys shipped by your colleagues from Lytton Bionetics to the vaccine manufacturers at Merck Sharp and Dohme. He got angry. He got really angry. First of all, he denied doing it. He says, oh, you know what you're talking about. We never did anything. I had a microphone like this. I said, excuse me, Dr. Gallo, I could cite your papers. He says, well, if you could cite my papers, then you got a paper I don't know about. You go right ahead. I said, okay. Adamson, Herrera, Gallo et al. Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, 1970. In fact, Dr. Gallo, you might recall presenting this paper orally in front of NATO military scientists in Mol, Belgium. That's enough. That's enough. That's enough. Yes, indeed. I do remember being in Mol, Belgium. It was the first time I was in Europe. At the time, I can remember it very clearly. He's hemming and hawing. He says, but I want you to know that NATO funds all sorts of meetings. Meetings about motherhood, fatherhood, sisterhood, and brotherhood. And we were never really doing that type of research. I said, excuse me, Dr. Gallo, how about the Sarin, Gallo et al., where you published in Nature New Biology, recombining these different types of viruses to study the unique immune suppression, leukemia, lymphoma, sarcoma complex models? He says, we weren't doing that. We weren't doing that. You don't know what you're talking about. What you're talking about is like mixing apples and oranges, peaches and plums, and other tutti frutti. And the response that you just had was exactly the response that the Canadian audience had. So, and he says that you, young man, should go back and get a grade 101 level of biological science training, high school level. And with that, the Canadian audience applauded, and I sat down. Well, a couple minutes later, of course, Gallo apologized to the audience. He said he had a low-grade fever that day. He wasn't feeling well, which is a standard public relations ploy when you lose your cool big time. So a couple minutes later, he's escorted out in a huff, surrounded by two very large, well-dressed gentlemen. One hands out a card to a colleague of mine and says, Vice President of Hill and Knowlton Public Relations. People who are in public relations, advertising industry, know that Hill and Knowlton is one of the world's leading public relations firms. And this is the public relations firm, by the way, that the Bush administration employed to get us involved in the Gulf War. Because we, as Americans, patriotic Americans included, we don't like sending our troops off to foreign lands to die. So we need persuasion, you see. We need to be persuaded. So Bush administration hired Hill and Knowlton to develop a persuasion campaign. And their first commercial on the air was where they got a Kuwaiti prince's niece. And they filmed her lying, saying that she witnessed Saddam Hussein's elite guardsmen torturing and maiming babies and pulling them from incubators and throwing them out of windows. And we Americans, aghast, said, this is disgusting. How could they do that? And then public opinion for the war rose, and Bush said, this aggression shall not stand. And then they inoculated 700,000 of our finest men and women to go off. And a few years, a little while later, many of them come back. 200,000, 300,000 of them come back with Gulf War syndrome. Approximately 20,000, 30,000 perhaps already have died. Many of their children have been born without limbs. It's been spreading. And so you see that counterintelligence propaganda, it was only found afterwards that Hill and Knowlton had lied, that this was a whole lie. It was a complete hoax. Never happened. But you see, counterintelligence propaganda like this runs with two basic techniques. One is the technique of giving you, let's say, 80% of the truth, peppered with 10 to 20% of lies or disinformation, or 10% to 20% that they leave out, that if you had that 10 to 20% of the most important facts, it would present a completely new picture of what the real story is. So, what's the 10 to 20% that they're not telling you here? Well, here's what they're not telling you. You see, first you have the Pentagon denying. Pentagon denying that they would be suffering from anything, these people. Then, when they couldn't deny it any longer, they said it's in their minds. It's post-war stress and fatigue. And then when they couldn't deny that, and pictures of the chemical waste dump explosion started to come out not in the mainstream media yet, but they felt pressure. They had to come out with some other story. So what did they tell us? They told us that physiostigmine, chemicals, drugs, organophosphates, these people were given new drugs, new chemicals that were combined for the first time and caused side effects. And then the Pentagon, after more information started to come out, and they realized that they had these records. They were supposed to be holding records of the chemical and biological exposures over in the Middle East that the troops sustained. And that, interestingly enough, many, if not most of those records were blown up during the Oklahoma City bombing. And you see that now the CIA had to get involved. Rather than tell that horrifying reality story, the CIA comes along and says, no, 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 the Pentagon is covering up. And what do? They tell you, look over here, mirror, smoke and mirror over here. What are they covering up? What they're covering up is that the troops were exposed to chemical and perhaps biological weapons as the Scud missiles were being blown out of the sky by the Patriot missiles. It was raining down on these troops, and when they blew up the chemical dumps, the wind carried the exposures. And that's what the CIA says. The Pentagon's covering up, and the Pentagon's saying, no, 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 the CIA doesn't know what they're talking about. And neither one is telling you the fact is that vaccines, contaminated vaccines, were most plausibly the originator of Gulf War syndrome. Why? Because it's the only thing that explains why some people who went over to the Gulf War arena, who got exposed, didn't get Gulf War syndrome, whereas some people who didn't go over there got it. Here's what happens, you see. When you're given a contaminated vaccine lot, they create vaccine lots. Some lots are more contaminated than others. Some doses of the contaminated lots are more contaminated than others. So if you just happen to get a contaminated dose, then guess what happens to your immune system? Goes down. You weaken. You're susceptible to infectious diseases, susceptible to multiple drug chemical interactions. Wreaks havoc on your body. This is what they're not telling you. Schwarzkopf had let it slip one day, a couple months back in Las Vegas. He finally came out and said it was vaccines, he believes, that initiated it, and he's right. But what they're not telling you is that that vaccine, most of those vaccines, or at least many of those vaccines, were developed in by Tanox Biomedical Systems Corporation of Houston, Texas, co-owned by James Baker III, Secretary of State under George Bush. Major shareholder, George Bush. And that they tested that vaccine in Huntsville, Texas, in the Huntsville prison population. And the prisoners developed Gulf War syndrome long before the Gulf War. And because it's an infectious disease partly, the prisoners gave it to the guards. And I was in Huntsville, Texas about 4 or 5 months ago. And the guards brought it home and gave it to their spouses. And the spouses and the guards gave it to their children. And now they're spreading it to their healthcare professionals. And this you're not hearing a word about. So these are the people that lead Dr. Robert Gallo out. And as he gets out, somebody shortly thereafter hands him a flyer on the book Emerging Viruses, AIDS, and Ebola, wherein he sees the name, he recognizes the name, forward by W. John Martin, MD, PhD. And he recognizes that name, not only as one of the world's leading vaccine contamination analysts who worked at the FDA, top man in their Bureau of Biologics, in charge of testing human vaccines for contamination between 1976 and 1980. But he recognizes Martin also as the guy who rented a room in his house for many moons while he was living on the East Coast. And he recognizes the name because he had just been in Martin's lab a few weeks earlier, trying to find out what Martin was up to. Because Gallo, you see, of taxpayer money, was given $12.5 million new contract and a $50 million research laboratory affiliated with the University of Maryland called the Institute for Human Virology. So he recognizes also on the back of the flyer, in the back of the book, the name Garth Nicholson. as a colleague of his, a personal friend. Nicholson is the hero to Gulf War syndrome veterans. He's the guy who's been really at the forefront in telling the research community the truth, and as a result, he was pressured to leave his academic post at MD Anderson Cancer Research Center, where he was Gallo's counterpart, chief man in cancer virology and cancer studies. And they both worked intimately with the special virus cancer program researchers at Fort Detrick. And Nicholson wrote, "One cannot fail to grasp the explosive significance of this book and its main thesis, that biological weapons programs developed and field-tested immune system-destroying agents that now cannot be contained. A cogent, readable, and carefully documented book." So Gallo doesn't like that. He gets home. He calls Nicholson up. Now, I hear this secondhand from Nicholson. He says, "What the heck are you giving Horowitz, this loon, a good testimonial for his book?" Nicholson responds, "Bob, first of all, he's no loon. He's a Harvard grad. Second of all, have you read his book?" He says, "No." He says, "Bob, you better read his book." Here's his telephone number. So he gives him my telephone number. 3 minutes later, my phone rings. I pick up the phone. This is Gallo. My first thought was, I wonder what the world's leading AIDS virologist is doing, calling somebody that needs a grade 101 level of biological science training, high school level. So the first thing he says is, "I want to apologize to you for what happened in Vancouver." I thought that was nice. Good way to start. He says, "I didn't know who you were. Garth's filled me in. I understand." He says, "I understand you're a humanitarian. I'm a humanitarian just like you. And I have a lot of information. I think I can help you to understand the true origins of AIDS." I said, "Oh, that's nice." I said, "I'm very open to that." So he begins to talk and tells me about his family history. I've heard it 100 times. I've read it about it. People who know Gallo have heard how he got involved in medicine. And I've got to know this conversation is going to go on for a while, so I've got a little tape recorder by my phone. It's always primed and ready to go. So I said, "Dr. Gallo, do you mind if we record this conversation?" He says, "For what purpose?" I say, "For publication purposes, of course." And I find myself in the role of an investigative reporter. So he thinks about it for a couple seconds, and he says, "Okay." So I begin to record about another 30 minutes, wherein he lays out his chief objections to my thesis. And I want you to know, after studying those objections, they are completely and utterly bogus, scientifically indefensible, and I've got the hard documents to prove that. He would be laughed out of any scientific symposium inquiry into the issue. Next is, when I press him, because I know the theory is sound, I press him on it, and there's this thing about Gallo, everybody knows it, he himself admits it. He's got medical science's biggest ego. And he's always got to be one up on everyone. So when I press him on it, and I say, "But Dr. Gallo, don't you think that something like this was possible, not necessarily in your lab?" He says, "Okay, I do not argue with you. I will not argue with you. It's possible." Then he says, "But I could tell you even more plausibly how something like this could have happened by accident at that time." So isn't that nice? More news you're not reading. World-leading AIDS expert says the epidemic might have been an accident. Nice. Well, at any rate, I sent them a copy of the book. I said, "If you can make any additions or corrections, changes to update and improve the quality or content of this work, I'd be happy to integrate it into the next edition. Moreover, if you can tell me more plausibly how the AIDS virus might have evolved, then I certainly would be interested, as I'm sure so would 30 million other HIV/AIDS patients throughout the world." Well, I never heard back from him until I called him about a month ago, and I'll tell you in a minute what he said. "I want you to know that virtually everything that you know about the AIDS epidemic is a complete deception. In fact, I want you to know that virtually everything you know about everything is a complete deception." That's true. And just to give you an example, to introduce this most horrifying segment where I'm going to share with you how the vaccine was developed that most plausibly delivered AIDS to the world and who did it. Just to give you a sense of how deceived you have been, you remember the phrase, "The AIDS virus doesn't discriminate"? And the propaganda message is that you and I are to believe that white people get it as much as black people, that gay get it as much as straight, that rich versus poor, people all over the world, Africans, same as other countries, Europeans. Well, you remember a couple years ago they even said that white women aged 23 to 35 were the fastest growing risk group for HIV/AIDS infection. How many remember hearing that? That's wonderful CDC propaganda, a complete distortion of the data. They twist the data, deliver it as a political message, therefore it becomes bogus science. Garbage. This is what they do. They take it out of context. Now, just to present this point a little bit more clearly, I want you to know that the AIDS virus discriminates. I want you to know that the AIDS virus discriminates even in the high-risk populations. To prove my point, I'll take this from the American Journal of Public Health. This is one of thousands of studies that you can evaluate this information, the same information in. And this is a study of HIV antibody prevalence among IV drug abusers in 6 U.S. regions. Now, with IV drug use, what are you told? You're told that the risk is those bloody needles, aren't you? You share those bloody needles, you get a little blood transferred, virus transferred, you got AIDS. Now here, take a look at this. In blue is the percentage of people who share their bloody needles. In red are the people who are positive because of it, allegedly. Now, you see in San Antonio, Texas, 99% of those people who use IV drugs share their bloody works. In other words, these are the dumbest IV drug users in the country. Okay? But despite that massive ignorance, only 2% carry the AIDS virus. That's interesting. You know, same level of ignorance almost in San Francisco, where it jumps up to 10%. And you see in Baltimore, Maryland, all of a sudden it jumps up to 29%. So, you know, any epidemiologist with any remaining common sense. Now, I know that in Epidemiology 101, that's one of the prerequisites. You have to give up your common sense. But anyone with any remaining common sense might think, well, maybe something strange was happening in New York. What might that be? And you see here in Denver, it drops down again. And here you have in Tampa, Florida, far smarter IV drug users, far less share their bloody needles. No, nobody's carrying the AIDS virus there. But look in New York, the Big Apple, where you've got the smartest IV drug users in the United States. They all must have gone to Rockefeller University. But despite that massive intelligence, a whooping 61% carry the AIDS virus. Now, anyone with any common sense would have to suggest, well, something strange might have been happening in New York. What was happening in New York? And particularly, what was happening in New York, let's say 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years before the AIDS epidemic broke in '78 in New York City. But what was happening in New York? This is a United States government document. You're looking at a document from the National Cancer Institute monograph of 1974. We're in over New York City. You see what a square, that square is over also Central Africa, Uganda. And that square, according to the legend here, is liver cancer virus research. Liver cancer virus research they're studying. And you see herpes type viruses. There's a star. The stars are in northwest Uganda, which is where Lytton Bionetics research labs are in collaboration with the International Association for Research in Cancer. And in southeast Uganda, another star for herpes-type viruses. That's where Lytton Bionetics' monkey colonies were. And you see the same star over Bethesda, Maryland, where Lytton Bionetics research labs were in the United States. Herpes B viruses. By the way, how many of you remember late 70s, all of a sudden, you saw herpes becoming a big deal? Front page of Time and Look magazine, you said, you know, herpes is a sexually transmitted disease, and who did they blame? They blamed the hippies. You know, the love generation. And then also, herpes viruses, by the way, include simian cytomegalovirus, Epstein-Barr viruses, herpes B viruses, which now have been linked to sarcoma cancer development, and definitively chronic fatigue immune dysfunction syndrome, which of course coincidentally came out on planet Earth in 1978 in humans, the same exact year that the AIDS epidemic broke. Interesting. Now you're going to see how this happened. So these people wanted to study. This horrifying story goes back to 1965, when Saul Krugman from the New York University Medical Center. Where did you see that word? New York University Medical Center. Right, on the congressional record. You pass. You all fail. Another documented biological weapons contractor for the Department of Defense, Lytton Bionetics and New York University Medical Center. There, a fellow by the name of Saul Krugman, who was being paid by the Army to investigate hepatitis B viruses, which he believed, and his colleagues did too, were cancer viruses. That besides liver cirrhosis and liver inflammation, this cancer virus would cause liver cancer. So he wanted to study this in the human population. Trouble is, how many fools do you know are going to volunteer for this? Not too many. So these people covertly volunteer a very unique human population. Try Willowbrook State School mentally retarded children on Staten Island in New York. And in 1965, these people began to inoculate children at Willowbrook with these hepatitis B viruses. And of course, many of the children died. And over the 5-year period, 65 to 70, Saul Krugman and his colleagues had tried various heat-treated vaccines on these kids, and if they tried it and the kids died, their attitude was, oh shucks, we'll just have to heat it up a little bit more and try it again. And that research continued to 1970, when he felt that he was close to developing a vaccine to prevent hepatitis, and he now hands the project over to the world's leading vaccine developer for the world's largest pharmaceutical company in the world, Merck, Sharp, and Dohme, which, by the way, have direct connections to IG Farben and the Third Reich. So Maurice Hilleman is the fellow who Robert Gallo tells me about when I call him several weeks ago. He says, after having read the book, have you heard the good news? I said, no, I haven't. He says, you know that fellow who you heavily implicate in your book, Emerging Viruses, AIDS, and Ebola, Maurice Hilleman? I said, yes. He says, well, President Clinton has just announced he's about to reward Hilleman with a Presidential Medal of Honor for his service to American medical science and military science. My response was, I'm sure Hilleman's elated. Here's Hilleman's story. So Hilleman takes over from Krugman, wants to expand the study to include 200,000 human doses of the 1974 experimental hepatitis B vaccine. To do that, you need a lot of help and a lot of viruses. So, who does he get to help him? Why, his good friends and colleagues at the Centers for Disease Control. Why, you know those disease cowboys, those disease busters who are, putting their lives on the line to help you by going to the Ebola region of Zaire and, without gloves and masks. They're going through the forest, picking up animals all over the place, and insects without gloves and masks, looking for the Ebola virus. Right, I'll believe that. But yet most people do when they see that on television, like CNN showed that. And they get the disease people from the Food and Drug Administration, the infectious disease people from the FDA. You know who those people are, don't you? Those are the wonderful people who want to regulate your botanicals and healing herbs and take your vitamins off the market, or standardize them at least, in accordance with now a new set of regulations coming around us from the backside through GATT treaty, from the World Health Organization, the Rockefeller-funded World Health Organization, you see, where now, a couple years ago, we defeated the efforts to take our vitamins away from us because our movie stars got involved. Well, over the next couple years, you will find that it's not going to be so easy, because this time they're going to come at you with GATT sanctions, international sanctions they will take against the United States if we do not fall into line. That's how they've done it and are doing it now. So the FDA, these wonderful people who want to do all this to our vitamins, and if you're able to get vitamins after this goes into effect, like, for example, a good multivitamin should have at least 200 to 400 international units of vitamin E, good D-alpha tocopherol, not mixed, not manufactured, not synthetic, but pure. If you will get that, you will have to pay probably 10 to 20 times as much, and you'll have to have a physician. You have to go see the doctor for a signature on that. That's what's in the works right now. These are the people who put on the fast track for testing and approval AZT, 3TC, protease inhibitors, DDI, DZC, which most plausibly are killing far more people than the AIDS virus is. But they want to pull your vitamins off yourselves. So they get the FDA and the National Institute for Allergies and Infectious Diseases. Then these three government agencies, along with Merck Sharp and Dohme, the world's leading pharmaceutical company, develop 200,000 human doses in 4 lots of a contaminated hepatitis B vaccine. Now, here's how they did it. They tried to grow enough viruses. They needed a lot of viruses, I told you. They tried to grow these viruses in the children. It wouldn't work. Oh, couldn't grow enough in the kids. They then tried to grow it in cell culture. Wouldn't grow there either. They needed something live to grow it in. So they ultimately selected rhesus monkeys and chimpanzees. Heavily contaminated rhesus monkeys and chimpanzees supplied by Lytton Bionetics researchers. How do I know that? Well, I've got their contract. Now, how do we know that they were contaminated? Well, these researchers themselves said that 70% of their caged laboratory animals were environmentally contaminated with hepatitis B viruses and a whole assortment of other viruses, which we know now included cytomegalo, Epstein-Barr, the herpes-type viruses, and another unique enzyme-associated virus, reverse transcriptase-associated virus, that unique enzyme that makes the AIDS virus, was in a virus also there in simian foamy retroviruses that were also contaminated these animals. So here's how they made the vaccine now. They grew the hepatitis B viruses in these contaminated animals. When they had grown enough, they extracted the viruses out of them. Now, when you extract a live virus out of a live contaminated animal, all of the other viral contaminants come with it. And now they inoculated this entire viral mishmash, this mixture, into the children, into the gay men in New York City, and into the blacks in Central Africa, Eastern Zaire, and Northwest Uganda. Now, of course, many of these people died, but the ones that lived had developed antibodies. It was these people who lived, whose blood they took. And they shipped the blood to Merck Sharp and Dohme Laboratory, where they separated the serum from the whole cell fractions. And it was from that serum, that heavily contaminated serum. And also, to make it even worse, these people had 10 years previously received the Salk and Sabin vaccines, which were heavily contaminated with monkey viruses. So they were human incubation chambers, like at least 25% of this audience, with monkey viruses in their human bodies. And so they took their blood, and it was from this that they made the first 4 lots of 1974 experimental hepatitis B vaccine containing 200,000 human doses that they then inoculated, once again, in the different regions of the world, principally New York and Central Africa. Now this, what I've just told you, to make a long story short, I could spend an hour explaining it, literally is the only theory that has been advanced so far on the origin of AIDS that reconciles and integrates all of the scientific, documented, and confirmed facts. Now, why can I stand before you so clear and so sure of what I'm telling you is the gospel? Well, because I found the contracts. I found the contracts. You know how I found the contracts? God's grace. Amen. The story, real quick, I'll end it here. In fact, what you're looking at here is the contract under which numerous AIDS-like and Ebola-like viruses were developed. You see, then this is Robert C. Gallo, from the project officer from the National Cancer Institute. Here's Robert Ting. See, John Landon was director of Bionetics Research Labs, National Institute of Health contract number 712025. It was entitled The Investigation of Viral Carcinogenesis in Primates. That's cancer production through viral infection in monkeys and humans. And you look at the date that they started, those in the front can see, February 12, 1962. And you see how much they were paid was $2.153 million. Oh, there it is. It's upside down. Sorry about that. That fell out the other day. $2.153 million. That's what is on the contract summary report. $2.153 million. Now, that document reconciled the document that initiated my investigation. Because remember when we began, I said to you that it was the National Academy of Sciences, National Research Council in 1969, informed the Department of Defense that for $2 million a year over 5 years they could develop these immune system ravaging microorganisms for germ warfare? Remember I said that? Yeah. How was it, you might ask, that the National Academy of Sciences knew that it would take $2 million over 5 years, $2 million every year for 5 years to do this work? How did they know? They had, obviously, just done it. Now, this information God wants to come out. How do I know that for certain? Because it was only this way that I found these contracts. I thought I was done. You know how sometimes you think you're done and God thinks something else? So I thought I was done with this investigation. I'm on my way home. My wife and I and my little baby, we were a 2-year-old Elena. We're on our way back from Florida, driving to New York, and what happens is that I call New York ahead of time. We were supposed to do a seminar. They canceled the seminar because they had painted the auditorium and they didn't want to intoxicate the audience. So they canceled the seminar, gave me 2 days down. We decided to go to University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, Davis Library, and my wife and the baby could tittle around in the town. It was a beautiful spring day. The flowers, blossoms were coming out. And I would go to the library. So I go to the library to get 2 congressional records references. That's it. That's all I need, and I'm done, I figure. So I get a library pass to the government documents office. I go to the library. There's a big librarian there. He's 6'3". He's about 300 pounds. This guy's got a sophisticated air of library science all about him, you know. So I show him my pass. I said, I wonder if you could help me. Here's my references. I need to get these 2 congressional records. He says, follow me. So he darts off, and this guy's fast like a linebacker. And I'm following him, flying through a set of doorways, down a hall, down a flight of steps. I'm now 10 yards behind him, and all of a sudden I hear a voice that says, stop, as loud as though I'm speaking to you now. Stop. Turn right. Okay. And now I got a problem, you see. Because this guy looks over, he says, hey, where are you going? Don't mind me, I'm just going to have a look over here. His voice says, walk. He says, no, your congressional records are over here. I say, don't mind me, I'm just going to have a quick look over here. He says, no, your congressional records are this way. I said, look, I'm just going to have a quick look over here, just don't mind. I won't do anything wrong. He says, that's not how you do research. You get your citation and you look it up. I say, fine. I hear this voice say, just walk. I said, fine, thank you. I'm just going to have a quick look over here. I hear this voice say, walk. I'm walking. He says, okay. He gets frustrated. He says, okay, I'll go get your congressional records. So I'm walking. I'm following this voice. It says, walk, slow, stop. I stop. It says, turn left. It says, walk. I'm now walking down an aisle of about 60, 70 yards long, 8-foot-high stacks on both sides, hundreds of thousands of volumes on both sides. This voice says, walk. I'm walking. It says, slow. It says, slow. Stop. Look down, left, knee high. I look down, left, knee high. They're the words, special virus cancer program, project reports, 1971, pop into my face. I said, I think I found what I'm looking for. I opened this thing up. It just happened to open up the thumb, okay, miracle. Open up. Lytton Bionetics Research Project summary reports contained all of the names, all of the organizational structure, the affiliations, the academic affiliations, what they did, when they did it, how they did it, including how much U.S. taxpayer money they paid. We paid for it. Our parents paid for it. So I want to share with you that this is all part of a great plan, and I'm privileged. It is such a blessing and a gift for me to be able to be here today and share this information with you. I believe that because of your prayers and the prayers of tens of thousands of people all over this world, I am still here to share this information. Because many of you thought, aren't you afraid for your life? How come you're still alive, Horowitz? A better question, higher quality question, because it's the questions that we ask ourselves at any given moment. The quality of the questions determine the quality of the outcomes that we are able to produce in life. So the higher quality question in this regard is, what is the risk to one human being or one career in comparison to the potential benefit to humanity for bringing this information out and sharing it with others? So, thank you. Thank you. What I didn't tell you so far is that it was Henry Kissinger in 1968, when he became National Security Advisor under Richard Nixon, that the option to develop these types of viruses was selected. Selected, apparently, by Kissinger. You see, when Kissinger took over under Nixon as National Security Advisor, the most powerful man in American intelligence, he immediately ordered Melvin Laird to do a reassessment of America's biological weapons capabilities. He was looking for alternatives to nuclear weapons. How did Kissinger become the nuclear weapons guru of the world? Well, Nelson Rockefeller made Henry Kissinger the Council of Foreign Relations Nuclear Weapons Study Group Director in 1955. As a result, he became the guru, and as a result, we now have nuclear weapons deployed around the face of the planet. In fact, it was Henry Kissinger. I remember, I was born in '52, and I remember as a youngster in grade school running downstairs in our schools with nuclear weapons drills. And I was afraid. I don't know about you, those of you who remember doing that. I was afraid. It sent chills down my spine. At that point, I didn't even know what we were doing. But it was Henry Kissinger's statement, quote, that a fallout shelter in every home in America is that a price that Americans should be willing to pay for their freedom, end quote. So that Kissinger now is looking for alternatives to nuclear weapons because, you know, nuclear weapons are kind of messy. They destroy the infrastructure. You know, they destroy the buildings and things, and, you know, they blow up everything, and it's expensive to rebuild the stuff that's valuable. And biological weapons are so much cleaner and so much less expensive. And you can literally kill off the same numbers of people, if not more. So the order was given to develop these, and of course then you had, as a result of that, the 1969 communication between Department of Defense and National Academy of Sciences, National Research Council, around the same time that Duisberg was serving with them and around the same time that David Baltimore was one of their heads. So that how also does Kissinger get involved in biotechnology, and where does this whole thing kind of fit into the New World Order agenda? People have no clue that the New World Order agenda has been evolving for centuries, but the contemporary evolution of the New World Order is virtually identical to Henry Kissinger's 1950s, early 50s Harvard PhD thesis called The Meaning of History, wherein he lays out the need for ongoing small wars around the planet on a continuing basis to maintain the economic alignment of the superpowers, of which the war against AIDS, the war against drugs, the war against crime, the war against illiteracy, the war against illegal immigration, all of these useless wars that taxpayers are spending countless fortunes to fund, only building huge dysfunctional bureaucracies and funding the coffers of the oligarchy, the shadow governors. So this is the Rockefeller-led, principally military, medical, industrial complex today. And medicine, you know, it's fabulous. It's now, at least in the United States, over 15% of the gross national product. It's as huge an industry as is military. So, you know, you reports more people are dying from, living off of cancer than dying from cancer, and it's true. And who started the cancer industry but the Rockefellers in the 1920s? So Kissinger's role, where does he fit in, where does he really go back to in this whole mess, is literally in around 1938, 39, Kissinger leaves Nazi Germany, literally 3 months before Kristallnacht. He leaves Nazi Germany. According to Walter Isaacson in the book Kissinger, Kissinger's greatest gripe, leaving at age 16, when my mother, age 16, is in Nazi Austria, scrubbing the streets at Nazi gunpoint. Kissinger leaves with his parents. His greatest gripe, according to Walter Isaacson, is that why can't he march in the streets like the other Nazi youth? And in fact, in the Bible, it talks about, beware of those who call themselves Jews who are not. Henry Kissinger is a classic example of that, you see. This is a man who denied his Judaism. He has no spiritual reality. He has dons a yarmulke, like President Clinton, when it's politically convenient, and then takes it off. And you see, he goes back to Nazi Germany in the infantry 6 years later, age 23, never fires a shot. Immediately gets boosted up into American intelligence, among the highest positions, as the right-hand man, the chief translator for General Bolling, who's Joint Intelligence Commission director, the, quote, godfather to Project Paperclip. Kissinger becomes American intelligence's chief Nazi hunter. His assignment to seek out and find Nazis, not for war crime trials, as we all believed, but for service to American intelligence and American industry. This was all done under top-secret project codenamed Paperclip, Project Paperclip, which was the exfiltration of approximately 2,000 Nazis out of Germany through the Rat Line, the secret railroad that went from Germany to Rome, wherein, before the war's end, they got out almost all of the highest-level Nazis and all the Nazi money, including the gold. In the newspapers recently, at least in the United States, USA Today had 5 days where they had a special thing that said not only where did the gold go, but the Red Cross knew that the Nazis were up to no good and they could have done more. Again, 80% truth. They don't tell you 10%, 20% of the most important facts. The Nazis, by the way, were given, many of these Nazis were given false identifications through the American Red Cross. They were given CIA identifications, like the false one of Klaus Barbie, who I show you in the book, Emerging Viruses, AIDS and Ebola, reprinted in black and white. Joseph Mengele, another one that got out in this manner. And Erich Traub, T-R-A-U-B, and his assistant, Hitler's top biological weapons developer, that they took out, and he went to work. They put him to work at the United States Naval Biological Research Laboratory. They paid them, these people, $65,000 a year starting in 1948, plus benefits. That was a lot of money back then, and for a lot of people today, that's still a lot of money. So this is Hitler's top biological weapons developer. And the American Red Cross, I told you that you see, it was Lawrence Rockefeller that put together the New York City Blood Council. This was the council of doctors that put together the New York City Blood Bank. These became the international blood bankers, you see? These were the people that allowed 10,000 hemophiliacs throughout the United States and countless others throughout the world to get HIV-contaminated blood, simply, allegedly, because they didn't want to spend $150 million to clean them up. Maybe they had a different agenda besides that, besides money. So the Nazis are getting out through the Rat Line. Unfortunately, half of the Nazi war chest, remaining $300 million at the end of the war, was laundered through, or filtered through, that is, the Chase Bank Paris branch, which happened to remain open throughout the German occupation of Paris. That's Rockefeller's bank. And that the Dulles brothers, John Foster and Alan Dulles, we have out of Washington, D.C., an airport, Dulles Airport. It's a hero to America, right? It was the Dulles brothers who were John D. Rockefeller, Standard Oil's chief legal counsel and chief business managers. It was the Dulles brothers that engineered the partnership, you see, between I.G. Farben, Germany's leading industrial group, and John D. Rockefeller, Standard Oil. It was, and by the way, the Third Reich. It was I.G. Farben that was Hitler's principal military armaments company. These were the people that used the concentration camp victims as slave labor to build and run their factories. These were the people that held the patent on the gas that killed those millions of people. This is Rockefeller's partner. Many Americans are holding, and maybe Canadians too, Chase Bank, Manhattan Bank cards. Buying gas from Esso, Exxon, might want to think twice. We are funding this. So, literally, it is a tribute to counterintelligence propaganda that we don't have the American Jewish community, the African American community, and the Nation of Islam, and the American Christian community joining hand in hand, picketing outside Chase Manhattan Bank in New York, literally burning Rockefeller in effigy. That's a tribute to the great effort of American counterintelligence, persuasion technology research efforts funded by Rockefeller and Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, who paid Massachusetts Institute of Technology $200,000 a year during the 1960s under the neurosciences umbrella. How noble. For, quote, public management, mass persuasion technologies research, brainwashing. So, the Dulles brothers, besides, remember I told you that not only what you know about AIDS is a deception, what you know about virtually everything is a deception? It was the Dulles brothers that clearly engineered the Cold War. Not only was the Rockefellers making money off of every side of every war of this whole past century, but it wasn't enough after World War II. They had to create another war called the Cold War. You see, the game was to separate people, divide and conquer the sheeple. Yeah, divide the sheeple to conquer the flock. You know, the international banksters. They make money off of both sides of every war. That's why we have the rifts that we do between the nations. They funded the Marxist, Marx, Lenin, communism. They separate communist from socialist, from capitalist, Democrat from Republican, reform from liberal, conservative. You see, they play it off against one another. White from black, rich from poor, black, HIV positive from HIV negative, gay from straight, Christian from Muslim, Jew from Gentile. That's the game, folks. Time we wake up. We've been had. They manipulate. The game is manipulate through fear. Today, somebody on radio called up and were discussing, like, am I spreading fear needlessly? My response should have been, you're a cult member and you don't even know who your cult leader is. You know, they made me the cult leader. This is funny. Warner Brothers, about 3 weeks ago on national television, they made me the new cult leader of all of the crazy lunatic cult members who believe that the AIDS and Ebola viruses are man-made. How about that? I have a great cult following. My 2-year-old and 5-year-old, and my wife supporting me. That's my cult. That's my cult. So, at any rate, you see, this is the Rockefeller Military Medical Industrial Complex. Now, the Rockefeller group began to fund in 1920s not only the Flexner Report, which outlawed all of the other alternatives to pharmaceutical medicine and healing. In fact, it's an insult that we have to call what we do frequently alternative. The herbs, acupuncture, chiropractic. This is alternative medicine. The only reason it's called alternative medicine is because the Rockefellers, they funded the Flexner Report, which then went around the schools and then legislation saying that these people should be outlawed, not allowed to practice. It was the Rockefellers, you see, also that started the cancer industry. How did they do that? Oh, well, they found that cancer was an up-and-coming thing. There was a Rous sarcoma virus that they discovered in the early 1900s, a chicken sarcoma, and that they felt that viruses might be associated with cancers in humans. They knew it in animals now, and they started an industry. And what they did is, and I wrote about this in the book, Emerging Viruses, AIDS, and Ebola, they got Mary Lasker. They called her Mary and her Little Lambs. Mary Lasker's husband was one of New York City's chief advertising agents. And so they hired Mary to get involved, and they played on the emotions and the heartstrings of Americans, saying that showing pictures of disabled children, cancer-ridden people. And as a result of that, you know, we gave a lot of money, you and I, and our parents did, to cancer research, the American Cancer Society. Meanwhile, we were just funding the Rockefellers, literally funding the Rockefellers or their agendas. They also started in the 1920s, early 1920s, what was called eugenics. The research that showed that there were differences between the races genetically. And this gave rise to the racial hygiene laws in the United States. In fact, if you were a black man in the United States in the 1920s and you wanted to marry a white woman, if you were in the South, you'd likely be hung. In the North, you'd be jailed, as just like a white man would be if he wanted to marry a black woman. And this was allegedly based on sound scientific evidence funded by Rockefellers that showed that blacks were genetically inferior to whites and the races should not mix. And now in 1928, Rockefeller's got a little bit more money to spend on this project. So he builds the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Eugenics in Germany. And this becomes the world's preeminent eugenics research facility, institute, and that this now gives rise to the people and the racial hygiene agenda that supported Hitler and his rise to power with his racial hygiene agenda. So in 1932, when Hitler co-authors Mein Kampf, what does he tell you right in Mein Kampf? To raise money for his political agenda, he tells us, oh, I am not a bad man, I am not doing anything wrong, I'm not doing anything unusual. Just look at, for example, I take my lead from the Rockefeller-funded research that shows that obviously blacks are genetically inferior to whites, and he adds Jews. So that a few years later, 1938, you have the purging of the European universities of the Jewish professors. And where do you think these people went? They went, many of them, they came to the United States. They went to work, for example, Rockefeller University. They went to work for Cold Springs Harbor Research Laboratories in New York, supported and funded by Rockefeller Foundation, Sloan Foundation, and others. They went to work for Yale University, where they have today the leading virology department. And they went to work for the University of Chicago, built by Rockefeller money. By the way, that's exactly where Dr. Robert Gallo came from, University of Chicago. And so this research continues over here. At the same time, it's ongoing over there. And during the Holocaust, you have the most hideous experiments in the history of mankind, humanity. Mild among the thousands of horrific experiments, they take large gauge needles, they jab it into an eye of a living human being without anesthetic, and they extract a little eye color sample. And then they do genetic analysis on it to find out which genes are associated with eye color. That's mild comparison to the other things. If you don't believe me, go to Washington, D.C. sometime. Go to the National Holocaust Museum. You see there, not only do they show you pictures, but they show you the medical artifacts. You literally see what they were using for tools to do this type of experimentation. So, after the war, eugenics gets a bad name. Surprise, surprise, it gets a bad name. So what do? They have to change the name. They call it the Human Genome Project. Great name, the Human Genome Project. And it continues full speed ahead at Cold Springs Harbor Laboratory, where approximately 2 years ago, they finally announced we have virtually completed the analysis of the entire human genome. Gene for gene, we now know the human being's DNA sequence. And now, because of this knowledge, we will be able to be much closer to developing effective cures for specific genes that cause specific predispositions for diseases in certain races even. Now that's why every month or so you're reading in your newspaper, gene for breast cancer in Jewish women discovered, or gene for sickle cell anemia in black people discovered. So isn't it interesting how frequently It's genes for Jews and genes for blacks that they're discovering. Now you understand maybe why. So when I talked to Gallo, one of the things that he put on tape, and I knew also that that was true. In fact, it was in Laurie Garrett's book as well, but one of the objections that Gallo presented to me as to why my thesis was not possible, he says that because, quote, we did not have the sophisticated molecular genetic biotechnology's capabilities to be able to create the AIDS virus gene by gene until 1975. Till 1975. Well, you know something? Alexander Graham Bell did not need fiber optics to make his first telephone call either. And I have documented evidence, just as David Baltimore in the definitive textbook called Biological and Toxic Weaponry, published by Oxford University Press, wherein Baltimore and others report that, in fact, not only did they have very crude methods, and were using crude methods of recombining viruses, just as I showed you, during the 1960s, but they were evaluating these for biological weapons development. It was a crude process. It took a long time. They would put animal cancer viruses together, mix viruses up. Then they would separate the different isolates, and it would take a long time to test each one to see what one would do. That's what they were doing. And I have documented evidence to support that. So Gallo's claim in that regard is like the others, totally bogus. But his point is interesting. Because you see, since 1975, they have held the sophisticated molecular genetic biotechnology capabilities that allows them to construct designer viruses that only trigger certain disease predispositions in certain races. So that when I was approached by this Pentagon official and many other people who were equally concerned about the United States military being taken out for accomplishing a New World Order agenda, a super government, you see, their concern was because the United States Department of Defense, the Pentagon, was preparing to inoculate 1.2 million military personnel and their families with a new anthrax vaccine, that their concern was that they could literally take out 37% of the United States military who's black and Hispanic with one injection. Now, my mother died a couple years ago of a flu vaccine, most plausibly a flu vaccine, induced disease called Guillain-Barré, or what they call the French polio, which people who have studied now vaccine contamination risk issues understand that Guillain-Barré is one of the most common vaccine-related injuries. And you see, I can't help but think that my mother, Jewish, beautiful, blonde, blue-eyed woman, who escaped these people in 1939 by literally getting on the last boat that made it out, was killed by the same people. Because you think that the agenda's ever ceased? George Bush, during his presidential election, was funded by the Nazis and their heirs. Largely, a great portion of his political campaign funds came directly from the Nazis or their heirs that they got out during Project Paperclip. You see, they're taking us out, and we don't even know it. Well, isn't that neat? You think about it. What did they tell those millions of people that they marshaled into the gas chambers? And they went. They went without rioting, without putting up a fuss. They told them that this was for public health. This is for your own health. This is for, quote, disinfection. What are they telling us today? When you see that vaccine legislation over the past several years, the past 2 or 3 years, for example, we have never seen so much vaccines and attention to the vaccines. In fact, the other day, the United States government and the Centers for Disease Control, in my opinion, committed a complete atrocity. an insult to intelligence. Unfortunately, there's little of that anymore. You might have heard the story of how contaminated fruit, strawberries and blueberries, allegedly came from Mexico containing hepatitis A viruses, and that the United States government then proceeded to make desserts and then ship them to 8 or 9 states. 8 or 9,000 children in the United States then developed hepatitis A. And who did they blame? Not so much the Mexicans. They gave the Mexicans a little slap on the wrist. Oh, it must be those dirty Mexicans. Just like those dirty blacks. You know, Richard Preston's the thesis and Laurie Garrett's thesis and Gallo's thesis that it was an African green monkey in the deep, dark forests of Africa where there's black people and it's dark. There's nothing like subliminal racist propaganda to continue to divide and conquer the flock. What did they blame? They blamed American parents, particularly mothers, for not getting their children vaccinated. Yes, in every newspaper around the country it was used, it was twisted and distorted. Instead of in every other industry, if you have a company that puts out a contaminated product, what happens to that company? They take the product off the shelves and they have congressional hearings and legislative inquiries, and they then make sure that they have high standards of disinfection, sterilization, quality, but not in this case. The United States government didn't do that. They blamed you parents out there for not getting your children vaccinated. Talk about absolute, consistent Machiavellian and Hegelian propaganda. Create a problem, then create the solution. In this way, distort, twist it, so it plays into the political agenda. That's how they do it. That's how they continue to brainwash us. So, at any rate, I can't help but think, based on this evidence, that today's physicians' offices and public health settings are like the concentration camps of yesteryear, and that today's vaccines are like the gas. Thank you. And indeed, and today's vaccines are like the gas. So what are we going to do about it? It comes down to what are we going to do about it? Now, this is obviously not just my problem, it's yours as well. Well, first of all, what I would recommend as I take you into the next part of this presentation, which deals with the vaccines and the comment that, quote, vaccines are safe and effective. We'll see how safe and effective these vaccines really are. But you should know that you need to, at this point in history, boost your immune system in every which way possible. What does that include doing? First of all, I want to tell you that there is no magic bullet. Stop looking for magic bullets. There are none. In the United States, we now have colloidal silver as a universal, being touted as a universal antibacterial, antibiotic, antiviral. I'm sorry. You know, the newspapers allege, or the columns allege, that this kills 600 different types of microorganisms. Well, how wonderful. I told you that by 1970 they had isolated more than 70,000 different strains of viruses. Everybody has been brainwashed by the pharmaceutical industry to think that popping a magic pill is going to cure every ill, and it's not. God created us with a brain so that we can begin to evaluate our needs and what we need to do. In this regard, to boost your immune system, that incorporates physical, mental, emotional, social, environmental, and above all, spiritual changes that facilitate optimal health. So physically, what can we do for ourselves to boost our immune system and our families? Well, obviously, since the soils have been depleted of nutrients and micronutrients for, well, at least 50 years, because in the 1930s, the United States Congress actually held hearings on the fact that researchers said that since the soils were depleted and human beings were no longer getting the required nutrients in their bodies from the vegetables and fruit even, that they would need to have supplementation to boost their immune system. So today, obviously, supplementation is what we absolutely need, and that's exactly why your medical mafia wants to pull it off the shelves. Part of the Codex Elementaris legislation, propaganda, and objective. I recently returned from France, wherein Belzhinsky worked with Gallo, Montaigne, among the most esteemed of all the world's molecular biologists and virologists and cancer researchers, published side by side, presented side by side with these top people, until one day he published a paper and came out with a paper that contradicted his superior's statement that reverse transcriptase, that unique enzyme that calls for life to operate in reverse, Belzhinsky found it in bacteria. His superior said it didn't exist in bacteria, and he got axed. He got fired. So he began to research his own methods, and he started to study plant extracts as anti-cancer drugs. And by the late 80s, early 90s, he had such a large following that the medical mafia in France became concerned. And they started to target him. And he was so famous that French President Mitterrand, when all of his physicians pronounced him dead and said he had only days, if most weeks, to live, Mitterrand then went to Belzhinsky. And Belzhinsky, with his cancer treatments, kept him alive for another 18 months. And don't you know, when I went to visit him, he was literally locked in his apartment. They had taken away his passport. He couldn't travel. He couldn't write. He couldn't speak. He couldn't present his research before anyone. They came into his laboratory, handcuffed him, escorted him to jail. And that's an example of what they do. By the way, he gave me a paper. In a couple minutes, I'm going to talk about hepatitis B vaccines as an example. He gave me a paper because I had been meeting. I recently met with the Nation of Islam's health minister, Ali Mohammed, and the legislative committee from the National Medical Association, which represents all the black physicians in the United States. And Ali Mohammed has recommended a moratorium on vaccines. And the National Medical Association is involved, and so the Centers for Disease Control got involved, and I met with CDC officials a few weeks ago. And we're now forming a committee. See, your support is so urgent in this area. That's why your grassroots support gives me the power to say what I said to David Satcher, the director of the Centers for Disease Control, when he personally invited me and Ali Mohammed down to visit him at the CDC. You know what I wrote him? I said, I'm not interested. Only under one condition will I come. The condition is that you pay more than lip service to the issues and that you critically evaluate the role that your agency played in the development of the vaccine that most plausibly delivered AIDS to the world. Then I'll go. See, what gives me the power to do that are you people. You see that? The grassroots. This is a grassroots movement. The solutions are not going to come down from above. It is what we are going to do. It's the letter writing. It's the campaign. It's the phone calls. It's the organizing in your communities. It's the support of organizations like your Canadian groups that are fighting Codex Elementaris. In the United States, it's the National Health Federation. Support for these organizations that are making a difference, that are trying to fight this huge Goliath. So, at any rate, Belzhinsky said, here, you ask them this question, because that's what the purpose of this meeting is. We're firing hard questions at the CDC officials. Among the questions that Ali Mohammed has placed on the table is, besides the scientific evidence that shows that the vaccines are obviously heavily contaminated, and they don't need to be, is the question of genocide. Ali Mohammed told the CDC directors, I also want to have some serious questions answered as to whether genocide is an ongoing U.S. government policy. So, at any rate, Belzhinsky gives me something to give and ask the CDC officials. He says, you know, in 1986, 87, 88, I published paper and research on the hepatitis B vaccines produced by SmithKline Beecham and Merck Sharp and Dohme. He says, I found these contained a very highly carcinogenic enzyme. And I went to them and I told them to get it out, that they should get it out. He told me to date they still have not removed it. So obviously personal self-care practices in the age of the current and coming plagues involves avoiding the risks. That's why I can no longer, in good conscience, as a public health professional, recommend that you get vaccinated with anything until there is a thorough, complete, scientific, independent, as well as congressional investigation into all the documented, published facts. So, boosting your immune system, avoiding risks, avoiding toxins, eating right, boosting your immune system with nutritional supplements. I understand there are numerous companies that are doing some wonderful things with the latest in micronutrients and nutrients, colloidal in aspects. So read up about these things. There's lots of books. There's lots of other authorities that can tell you that. As a matter of fact, right now in press is a Taking Care of Yourself program that I'm putting together. I'm still working on it. It should be available by September, October 1997, where I lay out what we need to do for ourselves physically and then mentally, emotionally, socially, environmentally, spiritually, to boost our immune system. So what do you think about mentally? Obviously, positive thinking. You can't get down about this stuff. You just got to get activated. Now, I know that's hard to say. It's harder to do for you. Here's what you have to go through. You know Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's death and dying model? That's what you literally have to go through. I want you to know I didn't sleep for 9 months. I don't wish that on you. I hope you don't have to go through that. But literally, the first part of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's death and dying model, see, it's the concept that our governments are in supporting our health and doing things for our benefit is something that has to die. And in the process of that, there's a part of us that dies too, the trusting self. And that's painful. So the first thing that Elizabeth Kubler-Ross says, we've got to be in denial. I was in denial about this for a solid 8 months before I began to investigate that document. So you got to go through denial. People who are in denial, bless them, and let them stay in denial for a little while longer. The next thing is you get to anger. You get a little angry about it. Many of you here tonight are starting to get angry or agitated and upset about this, and that's good. You got to graduate out of there, too. After anger, you get to acceptance. After acceptance, then you can begin to become functional again and literally productive, optimally productive, and begin to make a difference politically. We'll talk about that in a couple minutes. So, but these are the mental stages that you will have to go through. Now, mental, emotional are intimately related. What can benefit you mentally, emotionally is improved relationships. That's accomplished through communication skills, developing loving rapport, building rapport, loving relationships in your family, extended families, and communities. So after that, that builds social support, love. What happens then, according to Maslow's model, is a wonderful, incredible, miraculous thing called self-esteem. You and I, as human beings, immediately develop a greater knowledge of how magnificent and loving and capable and worthy we are as human beings, spiritually endowed to express and receive love and caring. Wow! That's precisely what the Rockefeller military, medical, industrial complex don't want you to know. That's why there's the dumbing down of the public. That's why you're told you've got to pop an aspirin to cure every headache. You don't have the power within yourself to do these things. You have to rely on the medical gods. And then you see, after you develop this thing called self-esteem, a major portion of this is the knowledge that you are spiritually endowed and you have a unique life purpose to fulfill. It's part part of self-esteem, knowing who we are as human beings, the magnificent gift. And the story of my grandfather comes to mind. It's a great example of how powerful we are as human beings, capable of fighting off virtually every cancer, fighting off viruses. That's why I say spiritual evolution, spiritual development is the most powerful of all self-care regimens. My grandfather's story goes like this. My grandfather died at age 93 because he wanted to die. First of all, I'll tell you a little bit about my grandfather. He cared and loved. His purpose of his life was to love and nurture his wife for over 60 years, my grandmother. He was a chain smoker, my grandfather was. He would smoke in the most bizarre way, though. Absolutely incredible. A way you could never imagine. He would, first of all, smoke unfiltered Camel cigarettes. And he would cut them into thirds and only smoke the most tar and nicotine-ridden, hottest portion of the cigarette virtually in every puff. And he did that for about 60, 70 years. And so my grandfather also was a devout Jew. Now, I'm Jewish. I'm very, very proud of my Jewish traditions, but I'm also somebody, I'm a little strange in this way, and I'm very proud of this fact too. I'm a Jew that accepted Jesus Christ into my heart years ago. So I'm what they call a Messianic Jew. Thank you. Thank you. You know, I appreciate that many of you are clapping. You know, many of my Jewish relatives and colleagues are saying, it's strange, strange. Horowitz is strange, you know, because they just haven't gotten it yet. You know, the magnificent message of Jesus Christ was love. It was straight love. Here's how to do it. He laid it out. Just got to read it. It's amazing to me that, you know, Jewish people have an aversion to even reading the New Testament. Well, at any rate, you know, it's again because of brainwashing technologies, separating Christian from Jews. It's been a long history of this. So, at any rate, my grandfather was a devout Jew, an Orthodox Jew. 3 times a day, he would what's called lake tefillin. He would go on his knees, and he would have his prayer shawl, his talis, and his yarmulke on, and he would bind his wrist with the scriptures in a leather box, and he would put it over his forehead, and he would meditate and what's called daven, and he would be into God, and he would be praying and meditating for 3 hours a day, 3 times a day, for virtually, I think, every year of his adult life. And his magnificent love for his wife was what he was living for during his last 30, 40, 50 years. So one Christmas, it was around Christmas time, my grandmother went out. They lived in Atlantic City, New Jersey, and they went out for a walk, and unfortunately my grandmother slipped on some ice, and she fell and broke her hip. They rushed her to the hospital. They patched her together, and at which point the physicians that worked on her told my father and my uncle, his brother, that you got to take your mom and put her in a nursing home because your dad, they live on the 2nd floor apartment, he can't care for her anymore. So they considered it, and they thought that that was the best thing for them, so they told my grandfather, we're going to be putting you guys in a nursing home, and you'll like it. And he says, if you do this, I will die. And they said, but Dad, you don't understand. He says, if you do this, I will die. But Dad, you know, we already checked the place out. It's a beautiful place. It's right on the boardwalk. You can walk back and forth. You know, you can get exercise. There's people there your age. Mom will be cared for. They have a synagogue right there on the premises. It's a beautiful, beautiful place. If you do this, I will die. They did it. 3 weeks later, he was dead. And he died so fast that my father asked to have an autopsy be done because they couldn't figure out. Doctors wanted to find out too. Why? What did this man die of? And I was standing right by my father when the physician came out of the morgue and reported to my father. He said, Mr. Horowitz, for the life of me, I cannot understand how this man could have lived for the last 20 years. Every bone, muscle, and organ in his entire body was riddled with cancer. You see, what kept this man alive was his devotion and deep love to his magnificent wife and God's presence in his life. We're all endowed with that same presence. So that's what we should be doing for ourselves. Now, let's look about hepatitis. Hepatitis B, which we're now, according to the Clinton administration, required to give our 12-hour-old infants in the hospital. Infants whose immune systems have not nearly matured yet. We're going to dose them with hepatitis B. And when I talked to one of Canada's, a couple of weeks ago, Canada's leading AIDS epidemiologist, he couldn't believe it. Because in Canada, it's still age 6 that they're required to give hepatitis B. Well, does it make sense? The question, does it make sense to give our children these things? Well, first of all, I was in France a couple of weeks ago, actually a couple of months ago now. And there, one of France's leading researchers, his name is Mirko Beljanski. He used to work with Montaigne, Gallo, these types of people. Until he became politically incorrect, they pushed him out. He started to study plant extracts and its effects, anti-cancer effects. He had such a large anti-cancer following, cures, that French President Mitterrand, when the authorities told him he's only got 2 weeks to live, he went to Mirko Beljanski, and he lived for another 18 months just on the plant extracts. So this fellow handed me a document saying, since you're going to be speaking with the CDC, ask them this question. Why haven't Merck Sharp and Dohme and SmithKline Beecham, the makers of the hepatitis B vaccines, removed the highly carcinogenic enzyme in their vaccines? I reported it in the medical science literature. Here's the report. I contacted them personally. They still haven't removed it. Ask them why. Now let's think about it. Hepatitis B is a blood-borne pathogen. It's primarily far and away a sexually transmitted disease, and IV drug users are the only other major risk group. That means handles well over 90% of all cases of hepatitis B, which 98% of the people, 99% of the people who get this develop natural immunity, and they're not infectious. Now, let's think about the risk-benefit of taking hepatitis B vaccines. If you press the pharmaceutical companies, Merck and SmithKline, on information about this, they will tell you, if you press them, that 30%, first of all, how effective are these? 30% of these people who get vaccinated don't develop any immunity. No antibody response. Non-responders. Then they press them a little more. They tell you, well, yeah, you have to get rechecked every 7 years. Get your blood, $175 blood test to get rechecked to see if you're maintaining the antibodies. Every 7 years, if you're below age 55, every 5 years, if your immune systems are less strong, like children. So does that mean now at every 7 years you got to take your infant back at age 7? And they're still not nearly in sexually active years. They're still not using IV drugs. $175 blood test plus more expense, boosters, more injections. And then age 14. Now the kids, unfortunately, are thinking about sexually active years. Does that mean you got to now bring your teenager in and you try to get a teenager to do anything, let alone go to a physician's office and get stuck? That's a good one. So, but that's not the most important. When you read the insert, it becomes more urgent. You see the side effects. List the side effects. From 15% of those who get injected, every time they get injected, sustain a little inflammation, a little swelling. And I suppose parents who are concerned about saving their children's lives, hey, we can live with that, no problem. 14% develop a little cold, like flu-like symptoms. Hey, no big deal. A couple days it's gone, okay. 12, 13% more severe, higher fevers. Lasts a little longer, maybe a week or two. 11, 12%, even longer. Now, as a parent, we get worried. Parents, we get worried now. It says about 8, 9% more severe long-term problems. 6, 7%, potentially long-term chronic illnesses. 3, 4, even more, 2, 3, more, and then it finally gets down to where it says, quote, less than 1% have serious injuries, end quote. They don't tell you what the serious injuries are. I'll tell you right now. They're death, they're brain damage, or they're chronic crippling rheumatoid arthritis. Now, let's be extra kind to these people, but let's do the analysis. These people want to inoculate approximately 90% of 50 million children in the United States. Let's cut it in half. Let's say only 20 to 25 million children. But however, when these people tell me less than 1%, I'm sorry. I've just spent 3 years, 4 years investigating who they are. I wrote a book about it. That's why I urge you to read the book. So you see whose hands you're giving your children's health and safety over to. It's a wake-up call. And you know I can't trust these people, and you can't either as far as you can throw them. So when they tell me less than 1%, I'm sorry, as a public health professional, I now, given this information, have to assume 1%. But as I said, I'll be extra nice. I'll cut in half the potential population at risk. So let's say, what's 100 times 20 to 25 million? That's 250,000, 200 to 250,000 children. That's 200 to 250,000 children who, over the next 7 years, will become dead, brain damaged, or chronically crippled. And those numbers on an annual basis rival those who have died from AIDS every year. Now, if that's not enough, let me use a little bit more of the Centers for Disease Control's own statistics to deliver my point to you. The ongoing Holocaust. According to the CDC, its own statistics published between 1990 and 1995, given all the vaccines, 17, 18 vaccines that they want to give, there were over 45,000 vaccine-induced injuries between 1990 and 1995. And that, they said, represented, quote, less than 1% of the actual injuries because of the gross underreporting, end quote. Do you know what they're talking about when they say gross underreporting? They're telling you that physicians do not want to tell people, report to the government or anyone, that the child sustained a vaccine injury. They will tell you, sorry, we don't know what caused this. Or maybe the child had something bad to eat. Or this is just God's work. So, when they say this, less than 1%, we have to multiply, let's again be kind to them, let's only take 100 times those numbers over 5 years. 100 times 45,000 in the analysis comes out to 4.5 million people injured every 5 years today. 4.5 million, mostly children, that's right. And what is that on an annual basis? That's over 800,000 vaccine-induced injuries ongoing this year, today, now, in the United States. Just from vaccines and vaccine contaminations. Now, have you heard anything about that? Literally, we have an ongoing holocaust of vaccine-induced injuries, and the public is completely unaware. I'm telling you that the ongoing holocaust is real. That 800,000 over 5 years, you're looking at numbers that far dwarf people who die of breast cancer, or prostate cancer, or any other illness. It actually rivals heart disease and lung disease, lung cancer. It was Hilary Kaprowski who said, this is the grandfather of this molecular genetics and bioengineering of viruses. He said that almost an infinite number of monkey viruses can contaminate polio vaccines, and he said that before Congress. Yesterday I told you that today's oral polio vaccine that we're by law required to give our children are littered with monkey virus genes that we now know cause cancer. John Martin says also they're associated with attention deficit disorders, hyperactivity disorders, adult onset diabetes, and others that he suspects. It was Adolf Hitler that said if you tell a lie long enough, eventually people will believe it as truth. And the greater the lie, the more people will believe it. You know, the phrase, vaccines are safe and effective, comes to mind. Vaccines are safe and effective. Vaccines are safe and effective. Never a greater lie in history has ever been told. Here's how effective these things really are. Take a look at this. This is starting in the 1920s. This is reduced death rates from Salk and Sabin vaccines. Here is when the Salk vaccine was initiated. This is when the Sabin vaccine is initiated. You see that these vaccines had virtually little, if any, effect on the general trend. When I was at Harvard finishing my master's in public health, what was I told? Like everybody else in the 70s and early 80s, we were told that the major reduction in the world's infectious diseases was associated with improvements of hygiene and nutrition. And we are now being told it has nothing to do with anything but good vaccines and modern medicine. You bet, baloney. This is the reduction in measles. You see the same trend for measles in the United States and England. And how effective are these things? And how safe are these? When over the past 17 years, that is all of the cases of polio in the United States have been vaccine-induced. And allegedly, they argue why we don't keep vaccinating these kids with these oral polio vaccines that deliver monkey virus genes and cancer genes to the body. When said, why don't we stop? They say, because of the immigrants may be bringing this in. So why don't they do something about the illegal immigration? So here you go. Now look at this. Again, 87%. This is vaccine-induced. This is in my state alone, Massachusetts. They had a 642% increase in polio cases the year that they started to vaccinate. This is what they do. They play games. This was meningitis cases before polio vaccines. This was levels of meningitis. This was polio cases. Here's after the vaccines. You see a disappearance of polio. Oh, what's this? Meningitis. Many of you in this audience know people, children, who have had meningitis. It is now believed by lots of scientists that these are associated with vaccine contaminants and vaccine issues. Jonas Salk himself said when you inoculate children with a polio vaccine, you don't sleep well for 2 or 3 weeks. You know, they change, they play games, they change standards, they do all sorts of things. This is how effective are these things when you see that when they give them DPT, the most horrific of all of the vaccines, most deadly and costly. 46% of the children who got whooping cough had been vaccinated. 1984 statistics. This is 58% of those who got measles vaccines developed measles. How effective are these things? Here you see whooping cough, pertussis, drop-off, significant drop-off. Nothing really associated with the vaccine. It was on its way out. And then the horrifying reality of a child having been given a DPT vaccine and sustaining those injuries is beyond your nightmares as a parent. You never want to live through the horrifying reality that the child can't breathe, has difficulty breathing, high fever, pain, swelling, projectile vomiting, sleeplessness, inconsolable crying like they're possessed. Just can't stop crying. Seizures, collapse, breathing problems, brain damage. Sudden infant death, by the way, indeed. Recent research shows that this is most plausibly vaccine-induced. You know, when they say the children die, the infants die, we don't know what causes this. Most of them, vast majority of them, are now known to be caused by the vaccine injuries, and they're covering it all up. Anyway, I just want to end by telling you that there are numerous contaminants in vaccines that besides the viral particles that may cause immune suppression, there are things like formaldehyde, aluminum, mercury, mycoplasma, Epstein-Barr viruses, like we talked about yesterday, simian foamy retroviruses, cytomegaloviruses, with clear links to cancer, in my opinion, to this day. When we look at what those cancers are that have increased, besides lung cancer, we see 4 soft tissue cancers primarily. We'll eliminate one of them. We'll eliminate melanoma because of its alleged link to radiation, or believed link to radiation. But that leaves us with 4: lymphoma, prostate, breast. And when you see that these people were manipulating, as I've written and show you the facts in the book Emerging Viruses, AIDS and Ebola, you see that they were manipulating viruses for breast cancer, viruses for prostate cancer. They were looking specifically at lymphoma during the late 60s and early 70s. This is the research they were doing. In my opinion, and I'm very clear about this, we have not just had the AIDS epidemic outbreak, or Ebola. We've had virtually everything break out of these people's labs.